So good morning, everyone, and good morning for all those that are now following us here on this channel from not only from the Americas, but also from the European continent as well as from Asia. My today's guest is Senem Aydin Duzgit, who is actually a professor of international relations at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences of Sabancı University, and also a senior scholar and research and academic affairs coordinator at the Istanbul Policy Center. Her main researches usually includes European foreign policy, Turkish foreign policy as well, and also EU-Turkey relations. So once again, good morning, Professor Senem Aydin Duzgit, and thank you very much for being with us today.
Good morning.
So recently you co-authored a collection of articles from South European society and politics resuming 20 years of AKP in power in Turkey. Looking at the articles selected, one can see that the more recent ones have in common the words populist and authoritarian regime. Even yesterday, Sevnen Gumuşu wrote that AKP has nothing to say besides Islam, and I also remember to read some harsh words against populism through the use of history. How would you describe 20 years of Recep Tayyip Erdogan ruling in Turkey?
Well, thank you very much, Alexander, and thank you very much for having me on this program. This is a very broad question. Because it's not easy to describe all 20 years of AKP rule in a nutshell, obviously, right? But since you did mention populism, I think it's something that we can start with and that we can start picking up on and perhaps expand further in case there are bits and pieces of it which you'd like to hear more. Now, the 20 years of AKP rule, those are a collection of articles which we co-edited as South European Society and Politics that have been selected with a view to reflecting what has happened in the past 20 years. And if you look at those articles, you will see that some of them are about, Turkish economy, Turkish society, transformation of society and politics, and also elections, what happened in each and every election and referendum and every milestone on the way to AKP's hold on power. And when you look at those articles, and also when you look at the overall developments in the Turkish context in the past 20 years, you see a country which has made certain progress towards democracy, human rights, rule of law, on the way to EU accession up until about 2006, 2007, roughly, right? And this kind of coincides with the first term of AKP rule as well. And then what we see afterwards is an AKP holding, getting more hold on power, doing better electorally, consolidating its rule as the single party in power, and then no longer needing the EU anchor or the Western anchor so much. And also this is coupled with, on the European side, with a loss of credibility and a consistent conditionality, that is the weakening of the commitment to Turkey's accession, which was never very strong to begin with anyway, right? So when the two things are combined, you see an AKP turning more and more toward populist authoritarianism through a strategy of governing by polarization, where the public is basically divided between them and us, where the us is demonized and associated with all kinds of things. Might be terrorism, might be conspiring with Western powers, as you've also indicated in your introduction. So this is the kind of rhetoric and the strategy which the AKP has used to consolidate its power and to be able to remain and survive in power. So it has changed. It's not a party that has remained the same. It has changed. It has adapted. It has been in and out of different types of alliances, first with the liberals and the Kurds, and more recently with the more far-right nationalist factions of the political spectrum to actually remain in power. So this is where we are today. In today's Turkey, the situation where they have actually brought Turkey is one which is where democracy has backslided to the extent that, we're living under a competitive authoritarian regime, as some scholars have also referred to it or have called it. And of course, the government has not fared well in terms of governance standards, including economy, overall state capacity, which has also been demonstrated in their response to the recent and devastating earthquake in Turkey, as I'm sure you've all followed. And also in terms of foreign policy, we have seen a Turkey that has zigzagged a lot in terms of its place in the Western alliance, in terms of its so-called hedging strategy with other powers, most notably Russia, and in terms of its, of course, isolated stance in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East, which has not really fared well or boded well for its long-term interests. So I know maybe I've kind of summarized it a lot and sort of probably missed quite a lot of important things, but still, in the overall picture, this is more or less what we're looking at.
Yes, it's not easy to summarize 20 years of ruling in the country, so not easy at all. But it's interesting to see that one of those articles, of those 20 articles that you actually published, according to it, so Erdogan gained momentum and rose to power in the aftermath of the two 1999 earthquakes, taking advantage also of what Ali Çarkoglu calls a paralyzed and clumsy government unable to respond to the country's emergency needs, as well as of a context of, and I still quote him, urban unemployment and the record depreciation of the Turkish lira. How similar is was this situation to 2023 Turkey?
Well, I mean, of course, there are certain similarities, but there are also very important differences. So I would be very careful in observing direct parallels with 20 years ago and then expecting the same kind of repercussions, because we are now operating in a Turkey which is very different than 20 years ago. Now, of course, I do agree with you. I do concur that in terms of the level of, destruction, this is a similar sort of scenario, considering, 99 earthquake. In fact, it's not similar, it's even bigger, right? And the tragedy and the destruction that has been brought by this most recent earthquake in the south of Turkey, in the southeast of Turkey, is much, much bigger than the 99 earthquake. But of course, the similarity there is the lack of state capacity. What we have seen in this earthquake, in many ways similar to what we have observed in the 99 earthquake, and I'm old enough to have experienced the 99 earthquake as well, and I've also suffered personal losses in that earthquake, that the state capacity has basically been eroded to the extent that the state cannot sufficiently respond to the earthquake. First of all, it failed miserably in responding efficiently and effectively in the first few days after the earthquake, which, as anybody who's familiar with earthquakes know, that is the most crucial 3 days. So if you don't respond, then you lose people. What you do afterwards, of course, is important, but it's not as important as to what you do in the first 3 days in terms of saving lives. So I think the Turkish state failed spectacularly and the government failed spectacularly there. So in that sense, it's similar. But in terms of the economic destruction, yes, if you look at inflation rates and the state of the Turkish economy and the living standards, there's also a similarity there. But the big difference is this. At the time, we did not have a single party rule which controlled all the communication apparatus, right? In the public sphere, including the media, TV, including the whole political economy of the system and the state architecture. Today we do. Today, all of this is happening under a single party government, which has been in power for the last 20 years or more, and which has had its opportunity to grasp, key points of the state apparatus, including the judiciary, the bureaucracy, and also, of course, holds almost the entire media landscape, if not all of it, right? So it's through these channels that they communicate their narratives, their own positions, which is basically somewhere along the lines of, well, yes, there have been a bit, a bit of a mishap in how we handled the earthquake, but we have, gathered our forces together and we're responding. And the narrative there is that, the government will deliver, whereas the opposition, if you go and choose the opposition, they might not deliver. For instance, in giving you your homes back, in constructing new houses, right? Similarly, in the economic realm, it's the message that, well, fine, things aren't perhaps too well, but then it's not going well anywhere else in the world. Like, look at inflation rates in Europe, right? Because of the war and all. So this is not unique to Turkey. So what they do is that they try to rid themselves of responsibility to either outside forces, to the opposition, to nature, like the earthquake was such a big catastrophe that no state could do anything about it, which is of course not true, but anyhow. So this is the narrative. And there is a serious constituency which follows this media landscape, or which is somehow exposed to it, which listens to this and which buys into this narrative. So in other words, what I'm trying to say is that this narrative might have a certain effect, and so it might not lead to a huge loss of votes for the government, for the AKP, as it had done for the ruling parties at the time back in the late 1990s. So this is where the difference lies. And I think we have to be able to see through this difference.
Oh, all right. And presently, I believe that Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, he has built up consistent results in polls conducted over the last month. And the most recent poll was conducted actually by RT1 and gives 54% for Kılıçdaroğlu and against 46% to Erdogan, if in case they face each other in a runoff. Another one from area gives 51% versus 49%. How accurate and how reliable are these numbers?
Well, it's very hard to tell with, these polls and polling companies. If you look beyond Turkey, if you look at other countries, you see that polls can be very misleading. I mean, take the case of Brazil, for instance. I mean, almost all of the polls predicted a Lula win, right? But their prediction, so the gap between Lula and Bolsonaro in the polls was much larger than what actually happened in the end. I think in the end, it was down to 1 or 2% or something like that. It was very close. So it's very hard to tell in these kind of systems where often people are also not so willing to articulate what they think, especially in these kind of populist authoritarian settings. Having said that, if you actually look, putting that aside as a reservation, if you actually look at all the polls that are available, I would say that a large majority of them suggest that this will be a 2-round election and that Kılıçdaroğlu will win by a few percentage points in the second round, assuming that everything, nothing dramatic or completely out of the box happens in the meanwhile, right? So this is what we're looking at. Of course, there are 1 or 2 companies which are usually close to the government as well, because, I mean, this is also important, whether the polling company is doing a proper job, whether they are politically affiliated with the government or the opposition. So you'd have to check all those. But there are a few, 1 or 2, which suggested that, Erdogan is in the lead, but they're usually in the minority. The overall and especially more sort of credible polling companies suggest an opposition win, but most probably in a second round.
But Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, he's presently 74 years old, and he also served as a member of parliament since 2002. Yet only presently he seems to enjoy large popular support along with Mustafa Kemal's CHP. Why this sudden change and enthusiasm around him? Why did it take so longer to change finally and to form a wave of support around Kılıçdaroğlu? And what actually can people expect from Kılıçdaroğlu? Which are his many ideas?
Okay, thank you. Well, very good question. A number of factors, I think, made this possible. First is the system itself has changed. So the system which AKP has brought into force now allows for alliances. in elections, in parliamentary elections, because they themselves are in an alliance with the nationalists. So it was in their favor to do so. But so this is something that the opposition has also picked up on, right? So what Kılıçdaroğlu did is that he expanded his alliance to include some of the former Islamist parties, in the sense, and also, of course, the nationalists through E-Party, right? So he's basically become a sort of a more of a transitional figure. So the Republican, sort of the president who would transition Turkey back to democracy and back to parliamentary democracy, back to a normal parliamentary system that is different from the very highly centralized, strange presidentialism which Turkey is governed today, which obviously is not delivering sufficiently and effectively in governing the country. So I think that's one reason, because now the system allows for opposition to unite. Secondly, it's impossible to defeat the government without uniting, right? Because Turkish society is divided, and this division reflects to the political level. And whereas the government's constituency is more or less a consolidated constituency, right? So you need unification through different groups. And Kılıçdaroğlu, can be criticized for some of his actions in the past. I also personally criticized him a lot in the past. But there is one thing that I have to give it to him for, and that is his patience and his ability to manage different factions of the political spectrum and to compromise, right? And of course, another final factor, I think, which made this possible is the state of the country, right? Because the economic situation, the governance level, the degree of authoritarianism is now reached to such an extent, and also the economic destruction, of course, is very important, that there is now a real momentum for the opposition. So that also kinds of, blows wind into their wings as well. And I think so these would be my responses to the first part of your question. Regarding the second part of your question as to what we can expect from a Kılıçdaroğlu win, well, I would say that, I see him more, as I said earlier, as more of a transitional figure who would, and if he can win, and if he comes to power, who would transition Turkey back to parliamentary democracy in a few years. So he is the kind of figure, I think, who would hold the country together while, Turkey goes back to democracy, human rights, fundamental liberties, independence of the judiciary, and the reestablishment of a system of checks and balances, which had been eroded over the final years. This is not an easy job. And you need to be in power for a number of years, I think, in order to be able to clear the system and get back to basics in terms of a functioning democracy. And that's not going to be easy. But this is what I would expect from him. And of course, another thing I would expect is to get the country back on its feet economically. I think they have a very good team, the opposition parties, both CHP, E-Party, and others. So I think they have the manpower to be able to do that. And if they also have international support to do that, which I assume that they might to some extent, that it might be easier for the opposition than the government to put Turkey back on its feet economically. I would not have very high expectations, as I said, as the job is a very difficult one, and it will take time and patience to achieve. But in my opinion, in many ways, the bar has been lowered so much in the past years that it would be, and the country which they'll be, taking from the AKP if they win will be in ruins in many respects. So it will be a difficult job for them to tackle. But I think they have certain ground to make progress.
From looking at the polls, what you see in the Grand National Assembly is a highly unlikely scenario of one of the parties to get a majority, or at least to get close to a majority. It's presently like a technical draw, around 31-32% for both AKP and CHP. Do you think, is it possible to form a coalition by any of these parties in the Grand National Assembly? And will this bring any kind of political stability in that transitional phase that you just mentioned?
Well, you see, the parliament is a very complex question today because we don't know at all how the composition will be. If we look at the polls, again, with my reservations withstanding, we see that in the parliament, it looks like none of the blocs, neither the opposition bloc nor the government bloc, will have the majority in the parliament. So it's going to be kind of something like a hung parliament. But in the current system, in the presidential system, which Turkey is operating in today, the parliament has a very minimal role anyway. The bulk of the powers lie with the president. So it would not hugely matter in terms of governance how the parliamentary composition is, as long as the president, comes from one party or other. You see, I mean, it's really who is holding the presidency that makes the difference. Having said that, when you want to change the system back to parliamentary democracy, of course, you would have to have the approval of the parliament to be able to take it to a referendum, right? Because this would be regime change back again. And this is something that requires a constitutional amendment, which then means that it has to be taken to a referendum. For that, of course, you need alliances in the parliament. Now, of course, then the big question is, would the AKP and the MHP group be okay with that, assuming that Kılıçdaroğlu wins the presidency, right? Now, we don't know. They might, because if there is a return to parliamentary democracy, then they might actually become the single party in government again. So it might actually work in their favor. You see what I mean? Yes. So it's a very, very sort of complex system. But also, okay, I said that the president matters most, but assuming that, let's say, the president comes from AKP and the parliament is a hung one where you don't have majority, well, of course, it would still matter if the opposition can act together to at least make sure that the parliament isn't a rubber stamp of everything. So, because there are certain things where you need parliamentary approval still, and there the opposition parties might be able to act together. But remember that there are also divisions among the opposition itself, right? Because you have the Kurds, for instance, which we haven't mentioned, which are most likely to get about 10% or perhaps a bit more of the votes. So they'll have their share in the parliament, where you also have the nationalists in the opposition faction led by Kılıçdaroğlu, which don't look eye to eye with the Kurds, right? So you can't expect all of the opposition bloc to act wholly in a united fashion on every single issue area under question.
And do you believe that with Kılıçdaroğlu as head of government, as well as head of state, that things will change regarding Swedish accession to NATO?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, to be honest, I don't think it will be an issue anymore. Mm-hmm. I have the sense that regarding Turkey's position in the Western alliance, I mean, of course, the world has changed a lot in the last 20 years. West has changed in the past 20 years, and Turkey has changed a lot. So we're looking at a different story here, where middle powers like Turkey are trying to find their place in the international system by not belonging wholly to a single group, right? Which is also understandable given the changes in the international system that we're going through. But having said that, I think Turkey would adopt a much more balanced foreign policy line between the West and Russia if the opposition wins. I don't expect Turkey to adopt European, sanctions in their entirety. I don't think it would. It would not be in its interest. It would not be in the interest of the country, especially given the current economic situation, even if the opposition comes to power. But it would be a much more transparent and much more genuinely balanced relationship where Turkey would no longer veto Sweden accession for the benefit of the Russians. Okay.
And even regarding the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, you think that?
Yes, I think genuinely there'd be a much more balanced relation. I mean, look at the situation, for instance, regarding Turkey's relations with Russia. Just yesterday, Russia opened a power plant on Turkish soil, which is operated by the Russians. This might be the first power plant that Russia has beyond its own territorial borders. And Russian President Putin was on Turkish national television yesterday praising Erdogan and Turkey and providing fuel to the election campaign. This is the kind of relationship that the current regime has with Russia. And I don't think this is a healthily balanced relationship, which they always, claim that they are undertaking. And I would not expect for this to continue if the opposition comes to power, which is why the Russian regime is so much putting its force and weight behind the ruling regime in Turkey. And I think that should give you some idea of how things might change if the opposition wins.
I have two more questions for you before we end this conversation, which is kind of fruitful at the present. But how does Kılıçdaroğlu position himself and CHP towards European Union accession? We've been studying and following the steps taken or not by Turkey over the last more or less 20 years towards European EU accession. But how does he position regarding this goal?
Well, I mean, rhetorically, the opposition seems committed to Turkey's EU accession. They say that they would support it, but they don't contest it. There is no contestation. But of course, so much has happened in the past decade or so that took Turkey further and further away from the EU accession goal. So I think in the case of an opposition win, one thing that they would have to reconsider and talk about is, even before accession, is to get their relationship with Europe, with the European Union, back on a footing of credibility and trust. And that will not start with the accession perspective, but it's going to start with more minor baby steps, like renegotiating the upgrading of the customs union, like perhaps discussing the migration deal and visa liberalization, and those more concrete matters of joint interest. Because I don't think the EU right now is also ready for the accession perspective to be, flagged upon it at a time of true crisis where, the enlargement policy itself is in crisis, right? Regarding Western Balkans. And also nobody knows what's really going to happen with Ukraine and Georgia and when the war will end and, whether enlargement policy will change shape so that it can actually accommodate these new group of countries. So I don't think this is something that Turkish opposition would push Europe towards, and I don't think it's something that Europe would be happy about to be pushed in anyway. So even though their sort of commitment to accession continues, I think there will be cooperation more so than there is today with the current government, and I think will be a much more positive environment for dialogue and bridge building, because so much mistrust has built over the last few years in particular. But then that would start with more concrete policy areas rather than accession itself,
but
at least in the short to medium term.
But that requires and it demands at least very strong commitments by Turkey, and it's almost like a revolution de facto to the system of Turkey. And here in the Western countries, at least from European continent, the biggest fear is the impact that Turkey can have in the political institutions of the European Union. Do you think that Turkey is ready for that, to the accession, at least to give those baby steps that you just mentioned? Is how ready is Turkey to start adopting those measures?
Well, it depends on what kind of measures we're talking about. I mean, I'm not talking about adopting the acquis in its entirety. That's what I meant by looking at the relationship from an accession perspective. I'm more talking about Turkey going back to democracy, Turkey going back to the Copenhagen political criteria, Turkey going back to more transparent economic governance that is aligned with market economy principles. These are the kind of steps that I'm thinking of. And then when you do those, you can start discussing about expanding the customs union agreement between EU and Turkey. This is something that Turkey can do, and this is something that the EU can do. Or you can talk about fulfilling parts of the migration deal, which might enable Turkey to get visa facilitation access, for instance, to Europe, right? I mean, these are things that can happen. And I don't think the opposition would find it difficult to do so. But of course, taking the entire burden of accession, while there is so much to do in terms of reconstructing Turkey's state capacity and democracy, I don't think is a realistic option in the short run. But I'm just saying that there are things that can be done that is not necessarily with a view to full accession.
Mm-hmm. One last question before we end, but does anyone know already what happened to President Erdogan, at least in the recent days? Was it a heart attack?
Well, I mean, there has been a lot of speculation, of course, but by the Russians and the Chinese and by some in Turkey. But most recently, the Turkish health minister made an announcement saying that he suffered from some kind of a gastroenteritis disorder, which has something to do with the gastrointestinal system, and that he's fine and there's nothing serious to his health. And I think he will start his engagements tomorrow or something. So I don't think there's, well, at least we've been told that it's not too serious, that they've given photos of him to the press where he looks okay. So it looks as if there's not much to speculate about for now, but this is as far as we know. Of course, I don't know anything beyond what's available.
It seems unlikely that this is part of some kind of staged act in order to...
No, I don't think it was. I think he was genuinely sick.
Okay. So,
because I've seen the video clip and I think he was genuinely sick.
Thank you once again, dear Sanem Aydin Düzgit. It was a pleasure having you here. I hope all of our viewers actually appreciate as much as I did to be here with you today. And I hope to see you next time. And I wish all the best for the forthcoming Turkish elections to be held on the 14th May, which is kind of 2 weeks away. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you. Bye-bye.